Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Will Morris. On February the 2nd, the OECD released detailed Pillar Two implementation guidance, 111 pages in case you were wondering. Among other things, the guidance addresses GILTI allocation and the ordering rules versus firstly the income inclusion rule, and the undertaxed profit rule, and the qualified domestic minimum top-up tax. Also on the design of the QDMTT itself, and on the treatment of certain incentives, including certain US tax credits. Pat, Brown and Karl Russo join us to discuss this guidance and what it means for companies. Pat, Karl, welcome.
Thanks, Will.
Thanks for having us.
Good. Okay, so Pat, first, somewhat to people's surprise, there were rules included in this package on both the allocation of GILTI taxes against foreign income, as well as on the ordering or the priority of those taxes against the IIR, the UTPR, and the QDMTT. Tell us a little about that.
Yeah, sure, Will. And it was a little bit of a surprise, as you know, because even as recently as a couple of weeks ago, what we've been hearing was that this GILTI allocation methodology and ordering rule was unlikely to be addressed in the implementation guidance or the first tranche of implementation guidance when it was released. But as you noted, it was addressed. And I think there's good news, significant good news, actually, and that is that we have an allocation key, if you will. It's only temporary. It only applies for the first couple of years of the regime. It's a little unclear what happens after that, but at least for the first couple of years, we have an allocation key. It's straightforward to apply. One can quibble with minor aspects of it, to be fair, but it is clear, straightforward. I would say it's logical. Essentially, what it does is it says, figure out how much GILTI is paid by a U.S. company, and take that amount of GILTI and allocate it to foreign jurisdictions based on an allocation key that, without getting too technical on the details, that allocation key is essentially based on how much income you have in a foreign jurisdiction and how low your tax rate is in that foreign jurisdiction. Now, for this purpose, how low your tax rate is, that is to say, what is the relevant local tax rate, that is determined under Pillar Two concepts. So essentially what happens is you take an amount of GILTI, which is essentially pulled from your U.S. tax return, and you take that amount and you allocate it to foreign jurisdictions based on a combination of U.S. tax concepts and Pillar Two tax concepts. So it's a relatively complex thing for the inclusive framework to have wrapped its head around. But they've done it, and they've come up with an allocation key that is relatively straightforward to apply.
Right.
Now,
So let me stop you there, Pat. So
sure, please.
As we look at this, you obviously have this allocation. Now, does it apply differently in the case of the IIR and the UTPR and the QDMTT? Yeah,
so exactly, Will. I mean, this is obviously a key point, and again, something that we were waiting for guidance on. So what's clear under this methodology that was released is that QDMTTs have essentially moved up in the hierarchy compared to all other Pillar Two taxing concepts. And what do we mean by moved up? Essentially, when you're figuring out how much GILTI you allocate to a jurisdiction, as I mentioned, you do that based on what is considered to be the local tax using Pillar Two concepts that applies in that jurisdiction. Well, for this purpose, the allocation methodology is very clear. The QDMTT is taken into account as a local tax that when you're allocating GILTI, you, the U.S. taxpayer, have to say, well, to the extent a QDMTT is paid, that is a relevant local tax that I have to take into account for purposes of whether or not my jurisdiction is low tax. Now, I know Karl's going to talk about this, but what that means, if I take a step back, is that the QDMTT is taken into account first. So effectively, GILTI imposed on a foreign jurisdiction has to make allowance for a foreign tax credit for QDMTTs, as opposed to the opposite approach, which would essentially say GILTI as allocated to a foreign jurisdiction gets taken into account first before a jurisdiction applies its QDMTT. So that stacking order question was a key question that we were looking for an answer to. We've now gotten it in this guidance. The QDMTT has moved up essentially above GILTI in what I would call this stacking order. GILTI remains, of course, above the IIR and the UTPR concepts, which are, kind of at the sort of bottom of that stacking order that I talked about.
Great. So, Karl, let's turn to that point. This idea of the QDMTT taking priority. What will that likely do you think, to the US's tax take from GILTI? Will it increase it, decrease it, no effect?
Yeah, so it should, for taxpayers that have a GILTI liability result of low tax foreign income, it should decrease the take to the U.S. Treasury as a result, because they're going to have more in foreign tax that they've been paid as a result of the qualified domestic minimum top-up tax. And so the amount that's the residual left over for GILTI to pick up is going to be smaller. Now, for some taxpayers, they are already in a position where they have excess GILTI credits, and so additional foreign tax paid doesn't sort of help them in any way. And so for those taxpayers who are paying GILTI as a result of domestic expense allocation, it's not really going to affect how much they're going to pay to the Treasury. So as a result, the overall proportion of GILTI that's attributable to expense allocation is going to go up, because the amount that's attributable to the low foreign taxes is going to go down.
So let me just follow up on that just a sec. So in many cases, GILTI will be reduced, so there's a potential hit to the US fisc. In other cases, GILTI won't be reduced, so there's a potential hit to those businesses instead, because they'll be paying more tax overall.
That's right. And then as Pat was saying, the question about whether or not and to what extent the U.S. provides tax credits for those additional foreign taxes will be really important to determining whether or not the overall burden on U.S. businesses increases or not as a result of those stacking rules that have been put forth by the OECD.
Good. So Pat, coming back to you, there are also some rules in here on tax credits, an issue which has started to generate a lot of attention in the US because of the possibility of UTPR taxation on domestic US income. So what was the good news in the rules, and perhaps also the less good news?
Yeah, and obviously, Will, this is a complex area. What I would say is the news that we got is good, but it's limited. So there was a big question, particular for U.S. companies, with respect to certain types of credits through investments in what we would call tax equity. So tax equity structures. And a lot of this would be low-income housing credit, low-income housing credits, in some cases production tax credits or other similar credits that are invested in by large companies through particular structures referred to as tax equity. There was some confusion as to how the model rules would apply in those sorts of structures. This document has introduced an entirely new concept referred to as a qualified flow-through tax benefit. And essentially what it does is it says, in those sorts of tax equity structures, these types of credits are given not a complete pass, but some really quite favorable treatment relative to the worst case scenario, which is essentially they're just considered to reduce your tax rate in a jurisdiction and give rise to top-up tax. So the news is good for those tax equity structures, low-income housing credits, production tax credits, and those sorts of structures. There's some confusion, however, on a separate point, which is, what about all of the green energy credits that were adopted in the Inflation Reduction Act last year? And in particular, those other categories of credits, transferable credits, which you would not expect typically to go through a tax equity structure going forward. What is the fate of those credits? And on that, the document is simply silent. It simply doesn't address it. And again, this has been a point around which there's been some confusion since the document came out. Has this document favorably addressed the green energy credits that were part of the Inflation Reduction Act? And the answer to that question is no. It simply doesn't speak to them at all. And so what we're left with are remaining questions around the treatment of those kinds of credits under the model rules.
Well, Pat, Karl, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And as always, thank you for spending time with us on Policy on Demand. We'll see you again next time.